All right, so we learned that when it comes to foreign policy, the president is the chief diplomat. One of the roles of the president, we said, is the president is the chief diplomat. And what that means is that the president is in charge of creating and then executing foreign policy for the United States. The reason that this exists is because while we do have a legislative branch, there are 535 people in there. And so when we're talking to China or when we're talking to France or when we're talking to North Korea, we want one single person to make the decision and be the person that that country talks to and looks to, not 535 people ranging from small towns in Alabama to large cities like New York City. So we want there to be a consistent voice in foreign policy, and that's why we give that power to the president. Now, that's not absolute. The president does create the foreign policy. However, the president does need to seek approval from members of the legislative branch depending on what is going on. So as a perfect example, we said the president is the commander-in-chief, and going to war oftentimes or using the military is an example of a tool in the president's foreign policy tool chest. Nevertheless, if the president wants to be the commander-in-chief, wants to declare war, the president does need to seek the approval of both the House and the Senate to declare war. Now, there's some controversy with that. There's a law that was passed in the 1970s called the War Powers Act that does allow the president to quickly send the troops into battle to respond to some sort of immediate national security issue. They give the president a certain amount of time to send the troops into battle before asking for the permission of Congress. So there's a little bit of leeway there, but nevertheless, the Congress does have the power to declare war. So that's one check on the president's power. Another example of a check is that if the president negotiates a treaty with North Korea or with China or with Mexico and Canada, if there is to be a treaty, whether it's a peace treaty or some sort of treaty dealing with trade, the president needs to submit that treaty for approval to the United States Senate. They need to ratify a treaty. They don't always do that. So after World War I, Woodrow Wilson submitted to the United States Senate a treaty that was agreed to by the European powers to create something called the League of Nations, which would have been what we call the United Nations if it had passed. But the United States Senate didn't agree to it, so the United States didn't participate in it, and the League of Nations went down the toilet. Almost makes you wonder if we had to prove that, whether we'd been able to avoid World War II. Nevertheless, treaties need to be ratified by the Senate. Speaking of the Senate, also, the Senate has the power, as we know, to approve someone the president wants to give a job to. So if the president wants to appoint a representative called an ambassador to a country, we have like 180 ambassadors around the world. Those must be approved by the United States Senate, and anybody the president wants to work in their cabinet. And when we're dealing with foreign policy, we are definitely thinking of for starters, the Secretary of State, but not just that, also the Secretary of Energy, the Secretary of Treasury. These are cabinet positions that oftentimes in working with other countries. And so while the president does choose who that is, that person needs to have the approval of the United States Senate. So the Senate wants to know what they're going to do with this power and what they're going to do in this job. And that person was chosen by the president because presumably they agree with the president. So if the Senate does not agree with the president on foreign policy, one of the things they could do is not approve some of the people that he appoints to his cabinet. And so that's another way of checking the power of the president in foreign policy. All right. Now, the president can kind of get around a lot of these things. There's a difference between a treaty and just an executive agreement. An executive agreement is almost like an executive order in the sense that the president just says, hey, the executive branch agrees to this, and so we're working with it, but we're not going to submit it to the Senate. An example of this is the Iran treaty or the Iran nuclear missile deal that President Obama's team negotiated. It wasn't submitted as a treaty, and so President Trump kind of is flirting with the idea of just getting out of it, and the president can just do that. So, in any case, that is the role of the president in foreign policy. They are in charge of it, but as with everything else in the Constitution, there are limits and checks to the president's power.